Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new episode of Tales and Tactics Beyond the Book. This show breaks down the fundamental concepts behind tabletop games and how we play them. I'm your host, Troy, and joining me is my co-host, Max. With us behind the scenes, as always, is our producer, Jay, and today is a very interesting episode where we're going to break down skill and ability. This is the numbers that make up our games.
Yeah, so let's, of course, with all of our Beyond the Books, try to define what we're talking about so that people can get a sense of the theme or the topic that we're trying to dig into. With a lot of these things, and especially in this case, the terminology can be murky, but essentially we're talking about the constant core statistical values that define a character or a unit in a game. There's obviously a lot of values that go into games, and there's a lot of systems for like how to rule on things, but these are basically the numbers on your character sheet that will be added or rolled against to gain results from checks and challenges that happen in the game. These tend to be referred to as ability scores, characteristics, attributes, stats in some cases, but they probably have a whole bunch of other names because humans being what they are, you don't want to sound too much like the other thing, and that can work for or against you, as we will discover when we get into some examples. Another aspect of, we'll call abilities and skills to some degree, but abilities especially, equally to skills, is how do you subdivide those aspects of a character? How many values do you need on your sheet for that to feel, I guess the scale is, it's generic and inconsequential as to the differences between characters? Or is it super specific and numerous, or the range of trackability with all these things? So for a starting point, I think we should probably get down to game one of role-playing games, because this probably illustrates it the most. Dungeons and Dragons.
Yes.
Which traditionally, the 6 ability scores. Troy, please name them off for me.
We've got strength. We've got dexterity, constitution, intelligence, wisdom, finally charisma.
That is correct. And through all of our sifting through games, these are so fundamental to so many games that many games don't even change them, even though they claim to be something other than Dungeons and Dragons. Though not changing them definitely begs comparison, which is why some people change not only the name and the divisioning of those, but also change them to, say, not calling them ability scores, but calling them characteristics. I mean, these core stats are pervasive. Like, even if you do call them something else, like we were trying to we looked through so many different games, I literally just flip to the character sheet and try to see what was listed there. And even if you call it something else, it's basically doing the same thing. Like, if you looked at the definition in the rule book, you're like, yeah, maybe that encompasses something else because they left something else out. But basically, if it says constitution, it might mean resilience, it might mean stamina, it might mean a bunch of other things.
Health, right? Could be something like that. Or strength could just be power, or physicality, or you know what I mean? Like, there's so many ways these are renamed and retouched, but the fundamentals of what they divide out of the player character don't often change very much. Sometimes they'll be amalgamated, right? Where strength and dex might be put into one stat, you know what I'm trying to say? Like a body stat, right? But in many ways, this original 6 is pretty consistent throughout many games and role-playing experiences.
With a few exceptions, it is either the starting point or a reaction to these 6. When we get into examples, we can start laying out like how different games do it. But I think the interesting part about them isn't so much, well, part of it is what you call it, but also part of it is how you divide up what makes a character distinct into these categories. So that's one aspect. We're just calling that ability, but you could call it a lot of things. My favorite word for these is attribute. I'm not sure why. It just feels right. Not every game goes with that. But when I refer to the attributes of a character, it's the things that might be numerically different between characters, but that are shared between all characters. And that is a common format for a lot of games.
Yes, right. These are the things that everybody has. Everyone's got strength. Everyone's got wisdom, but not everyone has some of the other things you may find on a character sheet.
Yeah, and the things that they have in that regard may be more or less than other characters, but it's sort of like an anchoring point.
Right.
How they're handled in other games, like how a game integrates them into a check, maybe is a better way to put it, that can vary a lot, and that might have more to do with the dice system or the lineage of game that it's drawing from. From abilities, the next part of the sheet, and this doesn't always have a name, but it is pretty important. I don't think we're going to get too much into the deeper implications of them, but we can certainly talk about their existence, are what I call derivatives, which are things like hit points, carry weights, fatigue points, spell points, initiative, damage bonuses, and what maybe you can sort of surmise from the examples that I've given, but the underlying part of this is it's something that's derived from those initial ability values.
Yes.
It might also be derived of other things like equipment. Like, for instance, I'm thinking of armor class is sort of what I'd call a derivative. At least some part of it is, because it might be based partly on dexterity, which is your nimbleness. But there are definitely values in a lot of games, except for very rules light games, and even in those cases, it still might exist, that you have these values that are summations of other values. And then lastly, of the category of numbers on a sheet are skills, or trying to think of other terminology that people use. Proficiencies sometimes comes up.
Yep.
Some games, I think we only found maybe one or two examples that only use skills.
Right. It's not as common.
For the most part, most skills are things that make a character more unique, because one character might have that and another character might have none of that. There's a funny point between those, which some skills are innate skills and some of them are trained skills. I think in 3rd edition D&D, they call them untrained and trained, but just for verbal acuity, I like to call them innate and trained.
Yeah.
And an innate skill is basically playing the head game of, if I had no knowledge of anything and I was just a body in space, what could I do? And this is where you get skills like jump, climb, swim. That's a debatable one. Persuade. A lot of social skills fall into the innate category. And there's a nature versus nurture kind of argumentation that comes up when you have those. Not specifically, but it's sort of implied, because they sit somewhere between abilities, which are things that everyone can be classed as having, and special trained skills that are really totally, like, if I'm a professor of nuclear physics, I might have, depending on the setting and the access to knowledge that might exist, I may be the only person in this group that has any founding in this. So yeah, innate skills fill up this weird middle ground where they're kind of like something that everybody would have, and they're sort of like something that no one would have. Because if you could physically climb, but maybe you've never done it. There are definitely examples of people in history or some aspects of common sense that would be like, yeah, I can kind of see somebody who's never climbed at all. Maybe they were like a sickly child, and then they focused on other things, and they were never physical or athletic.
Skills, though, they're interesting because you can give them that numeric value, right? Like you could be a skill 4 or a skill level mastery, right? Depending on how you want to rank these skills.
Mm-hmm.
But they can also be more of a trigger or a keyword where they themselves are more of like a point of distinction, less a numerically tracked feature of a character.
So early editions of Dungeons and Dragons, I know that 2nd edition, or sometimes it's called 2.5, made a much bigger thing out of these, because probably in reaction to things like Chaosium games or Traveller being more skill-based, have non-combat skills, but they go back a fair ways.
Mm-hmm.
I remember seeing them in AD&D, like the 1st edition. And you're right, they're more like I like to call them allowances.
Yeah.
Which is to say, there's no number attached to it, but your character knows this. And so if a check is called in, it's a legitimate concern. I think in some cases they're just sort of decided as being like, oh, I have blacksmithing, therefore I take some time to make a sword, and it's just a matter of material cost and time. Some games do turn that into a check, or that might just be a house rule, but that would probably be determined more from an ability score. So associating, I don't know, you're doing some kind of hacking or maybe lockpicking. There's a good example. The lockpicking example is good, where you have the allowance of doing that, so you just make a dex check.
Right.
And then that's kind of the basis of it.
Well, that's a way that a game that only has attributes or characteristics can still have effectively a skill system, as just by having these keywords that trigger off of the parent attribute, right? And I find that to be a pretty elegant way to avoid having a lot of numerics listed on your page, like you're looking at all these different values for all these different skills and verbs you can act on. Sometimes it's nice if it's just these allowances, these triggerable keywords that fit into your character that go off of your base attributes.
I don't see that as common. I actually see more like numerical values.
Yeah, me too.
Generally speaking, but like older editions of D&D definitely use an allowance system. Lasers and Feelings, I think, also uses an allowance.
Yep, that's another perfect example, because your attribute is just either are you swinging more lasers or more feelings, but underneath that, you'll have your keywords, which are allowances, that will modify or give you advantage to rolling.
Yeah, so like that's a good example for that. Now, another thing that I kind of set up, which is maybe a bigger part of this conversation when it comes to skills, is skill-based versus level-based games. Those might be a bit of a misnomer because they do touch into other aspects beyond how do you get good is essentially what the question is. But a rough approximation in the difference between those is a level-based game is more mechanically based on advancing through a class. Some people refer to this as class-based as well.
Yep.
And it certainly can be, and more generally, it is class-based. There are a few examples where there's still levels, but they're not classes, but they may as well be. But yeah, in that system, there's a career path, and you move along that, and you accrue abilities on a track which is more numerical. Like, for instance, if I'm a fighter and I go up to a level 2, my fighting ability is equivalent to my level. That's a very old school way of doing it, and it's probably a very economical way of doing it. But very quickly, we ended up with things, or systems, I should say, that are almost entirely based around skills. And like some of the earliest examples, probably Traveler is one of the earliest examples of a game being based more around your knowledge and abilities as numerical values than necessarily having a level track.
Same with like RuneQuest, right?
Yeah, and so RuneQuest would be one of the other ones. So those are some of the oldest games to follow after. And then Call of Cthulhu coming from RuneQuest, and pretty much every Chaosium game is more based around improving each skill rather than having a number that dictates how good your character is more broadly. You're better at that thing. And how skills advance, especially in things like Call of Cthulhu, are really interesting because, at least with the earlier editions, you only improve the skill. You have a chance of improving the skill if you've used it, and then only by a certain amount. So it's that one's weird. I mean, skill progression might be a different conversation, but that's another thing that distinguishes skills from levels is like, how do you progress? Like, for instance, levels usually use an experience system.
It's true.
You're given a meta currency that eventually advances you to the next point.
One of the advantages and disadvantages to both level and skill-based is how you interpret your own power level. Because level-based consolidates your rating into one key statistic. I'm a level 5 wizard, so therefore I have these spells, and I'm certain that things below that level 5 I could, warp or turn into puddles, but things above that will do that to me. However, a skill-based system, it doesn't consolidate your power level. So you don't necessarily know how you rank according to everything else because it's more decentralized, your character, right? You have all these different stats and some of them may be higher or lower, and it could create more complex interactions to the NPCs and other player characters.
My general feeling of that difference is that level-based or class-based games are good for people starting out because it gives them a very defined role that is easy to kind of, it's like playing an archetype where you can bounce off that. And I know I'm the warrior and I'm good at the warrior stuff, and you're the wizard and you're good at the wizard stuff. And together we can kind of cover these different niches. But as you begin to get into games that are a bit more role play heavy, not to say that you can't role play heavily with a level-based system, but one thing that I think is underestimated about skill-based games is because they're so nebulous, you begin to forget, or because maybe you can't fully grasp all the aspects of what your character can do by summing it up with a single number, you actually just stop thinking about the numbers in general. And actually that can help make the role-playing more immersive. I don't think Call of Cthulhu would work as well as a level-based game because you're thinking about your character. One, it's too linear a progression for your character. But also, you're thinking, oh, well, I'm level 5 and Cthulhu is level 100. And now there's this comparative value between like how powerful am I to like an elder god.
Yeah.
And that misses the point of what that kind of fiction actually, what that kind of game is trying to evoke. And it's really interesting when a game, I think that's always a tell to me, like what kind of game I'm getting into. Like, is this just going to be like a epic fantasy heroic monster fight where I'm playing the archetypical thief and going around, stealing things and backstabbing and having a jolly good time about being a morally dubious individual? Or is it something where I'm playing a really nuanced character and I need to know who that person is beyond the numbers on the sheet? The numbers should support that because I know how good I am in any particular situation, but there's no power level. I'm not a heroic character. I'm a bit more of an everyman. It's interesting where different games kind of draw the line on that one. So before we get out of that, there's a few other kinds of quirky elements, which I guess are other values, which I think do need their own episode.
Yes, I would agree.
But we can just, briefly touch on that.
Like an additional or alternative characteristic that I really enjoy is luck. It shows up in a few titles, Dungeon Crawl Classics, Call of Cthulhu being two big titles that feature that. And it's nice because it doesn't represent your muscle mass or your reflex or your IQ. It's something different. And a lot of times it's a spendable resource as well, especially in the two titles I just referenced, where you're able to use it as a resource to improve dice rolls or mess with fate in some type of way that can be very important. And luck as a characteristic also can tell you about the person you're playing in, again, not this direct, obvious way, but more about the way the world around them sees them in a certain way.
I guess it's sort of the character's influence over the plot.
Yeah.
To some degree.
Yeah.
And I've seen it in other things, fate points, in D20 modern action points were essentially the fudge kind of fix it kind of, or get me the big advantage on the damage or the hit. If I want to make that absolutely impossible shot actually possible, then, and you can see where the action part of that title comes in. But that was one of the first times I had seen it. That mechanic gets ported over in the Eberron system in 3rd edition. I remember that showing up, that they took action points from that game in order to get more of that pulpy quality.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and I've definitely seen other games that try to emulate pulp action. So I guess not necessarily epic heroes in the sense that they have like fantastical abilities, but just that little bit of an edge. I think that some of the 2D20 games have an equivalent where you can kind of stack up the advantage. And even advantage and disadvantage from 5e Dungeons and Dragons.
Oh, yeah, true.
That's a bit more circumstantial,
Mm-hmm.
but it can be used as a mercy in a lot of cases. I haven't played much of it, but that's the sense of what I get from how you could deploy that. But again, that's more of a rulings sort of, hey, I think I should get, or the GM is like, oh, you should get this because you have this situation.
Yeah.
I think that might be an easier way to calculate difficulty. I think that might be more about what it is. But I've definitely seen luck mechanics that are basically roll 2 dice and choose the better of them.
This is something else I wanted to ask you about. Because we talked about skills earlier.
Mm.
This is something you've brought up, but skill bloat, wherein you're using more skills than arguably are needed to achieve the same effect that less skills could have.
The skill-based sin of the 80s and 90s. There seemed to be a boom in skill-based systems, which is probably why 3rd edition D&D began to adopt that, because it was sort of like a trend. But by adopting that, there was a sort of cavalier attitude to what skills are, and a lot of games put in way more skills than... It's sort of like... So when you think about a skill, there's 2 aspects of it, and there's actually a few examples that we have that specifically tackle that, or the problem, but a lot of games, as they are pre-designed, don't. So the one example where this is directly influenced is a fairly obscure game called Over the Edge, where you can have any trait, and that is effectively like a skill, and it can have a number which determines how good you are. But the dilemma is this: the more specific the skill, the less overall effective it is. So for instance, if you have a skill in, let's say, building a mousetrap, your knowledge might be transferable to generally with traps, but if you have a skill that's just traps, it kind of trumps the more specific skill. And so it has to do with the narrowness of your skill focus versus the utility of it. And so some games go way overboard where they're like, oh yeah, we've got a skill for everything. And then when you start looking through it, you're like, how is that different from that?
Yep.
And also, by having all these separate skills, it's difficult to track. Also, the other problem with skill bloat is this is sort of sometimes what I call the language skill problem, where, oh, I can choose a language skill, but I don't know what language is going to be relevant for this campaign. Unless I'm being informed that that's a useful thing to have. If I pick a language, well, then it might just be a total dump skill.
100%.
And other skills work the same way. It's like, I don't know what I need to have to play this game. And so by having more generalized skills, you avoid that problem. But the other problem you begin to run into as you go that way is now everybody feels the same.
Yeah. I mean, some skills are really interesting because they can be zeroed in on something. Like, let's compare 2 skills that show up in 2 different games, but effectively mean the same thing. Consume alcohol is a really interesting skill in Warhammer Fantasy, right?
Yep.
Because it's specifically about how can you hold your drink. But you could compare that to a carouse stat or skill, pardon me, that would appear in another title, which likely encompasses the act of consuming alcohol, in addition to several other acts, right? It's a broader verb, but which of those is more thematically appropriate to the game and setting? That's kind of the real question that you need to find when you're picking, like, how many skills this is appropriate for a title. But it's almost the lens of closeness that you are to the act itself, right? With consume alcohol being like, bang, you're right in there. That's the actual specific verb being undertaken, relative to carouse, which is, there's probably consuming alcohol happening in addition to all the things, like maybe a little bit of gambling and some messing about and talking trash and all that.
Yeah. Being personable is sort of what carouse, but it's more about the social aspect of the thing, and less about the drinking aspect, which is very specific. This kind of leads me into something that kind of just occurred to me, but I have had a term for this in the past, which is what I call skill bending. Some people call it synergy, but it's the idea that I don't know what that check covers, but I'll find a skill that I think is close to that. And so the skill represents the emphasis of what it is. So my example in this is that you have a consume alcohol skill in Warhammer Fantasy, but imagine there's like you're trying to find rumors or something to that effect, you could skill bend that into finding rumors. You could also use a different skill that might do that.
Oh, I know exactly what you mean by that.
But that to me is what I refer to as skill bending, where I don't have a specific thing for that thing, but I can use that in a more novel way because it kind of touches on that thing.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
This can become informed or slightly complicated by another aspect of skills, which is generally, I find the latter of these two to be the case, but there are some systems that handle it differently. And that is broad skills versus linked skills. So the way that skills generally work in a game is they provide a bonus, sometimes with the bonus being added to the skill from the attribute, as in Dungeons and Dragons, especially 3rd edition and going forward. Or in the case of Call of Cthulhu or Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, the attribute acts as the main target number and the skill adds value to that. Either way, it works the same principle. What the difference between a broad skill and a linked skill, and these are terms I'm just making up because this is how we're going to intellectualize this. A linked skill is one where the attribute is directly tied to that skill, that the skill is an extension of the attribute or the ability. This is sometimes clearly illustrated like in a game like Paranoia, where the skills are literally categorized under the attributes on the character sheet. This is not the newest edition of Paranoia, but the XP, the sort of the last edition before being handled by Mongoose. And in that case, you can clearly see the connection there. Another example of that is Free League games. And that's really interesting because it's a very skill minimalist, but it's very linked. So each attribute has 3 to 4 skills. So in like Coriolis, I think with Coriolis, it's actually just 2. And then those values inform directly on how many dice you'd be throwing. Broad skills have the implication that it's up to the GM and the player to decide what the pairing between the ability score and the skill will be. So my favorite example of this is having a firearm skill and being able to shoot by using dexterity plus firearms. But if you come across a firearm and you're investigating whether it's been fired or not, that'll be intelligence and firearms. And the idea is that your skill is just your general familiarity with the topic, and your attributes are your faculties being applied to that.
I have a real passion for broad skills.
So do I. I don't think enough games actually make use of that idea because there's this sort of creative alchemy that comes out of it, and it really gives you more options rather than less.
It does. Especially the way that you can apply combat skills in a non-combat capacity by, for example, reviewing a weapon, right? If you have, say, firearms and you don't want to use your dexterity, you could use your intelligence to break the weapon down or understand it in a new way. And it's still tied to that skill, but just through a different lens.
Yeah, it's more about an interpretation of that value. And I think some people, even if the skill is linked, they do use a broad context for it.
Yeah, that's a common house rule.
Yeah, I've definitely done that to get some kind of check that actually affects the game and isn't just, oh, you don't have knowledge firearms. And it's like, well, I use guns all the time. Why would I not know something about how they work? And I assume that also has to do with breaking them down and working on them.
Yeah, exactly. So now to move on, we have some references we'd like to talk about in relation to skill and ability. One of the first that stand out to me is Chaosium's Call of Cthulhu. It has a few statistics or characteristics that you may not see in every title, some of them being really quite unique. The first big 3 are size, power, and appearance. And those are unique in that size is just that. It's how physically big you are. It's not an indication specifically of strength, but it does plug into that, but it is your actual physical mass as a character.
Yeah. When I first encountered that one, it was mentally a game changer, because it made me think of the fact that a lot of what makes a creature tough isn't necessarily how, and in heavy air quotes, powerful they are, which would be level, but more based around how big they are, literally the mass of the creature. The strength would have some factor in that. But yeah, the number of hits that you can take in Call of Cthulhu are basically a calculation of your size and your physical durability, or I think they call it constitution.
And that is followed by your power, right? And that is a mental stat.
Yeah, it's analogous to willpower, I suppose. I find it strange that it's not called willpower. But it a lot of it is your ability to resist spells and your ability to cast them, and also how many spell points, magic points, that you get in the game.
And the appearance is interesting because it seems superficially like it is charisma, but it is actually a numerical rating of, I guess, how generally one is attractive. There are different ways to interpret it, and I think that is what's important about that stat, is that it's not just, like, are you photogenic or not kind of thing, but it's sort of like you're the physical side of how you attract a person, as opposed to charisma, which is sort of as much personality as it is physical.
Yeah, again, being more of a skill-based game, the raw element of that is more additive or sort of supplementary than necessarily being the core thing being acted on. And I think that in some ways it's a sort of superficial name swap, but there is a suggestion of appearance being just not necessarily just how like aesthetically attractive you are, but also how you carry yourself.
Yep.
How you command attention, but cut off at that point. Everything else is based on whatever social skills you took, which are in aid or being aided by your appearance. Another one of these that I think is really unique in the ability, or in the case of Call of Cthulhu, its characteristics, is education as being separate from intelligence.
Right.
What's your sort of take on? I mean, I think that's really neat. Especially, don't think it works in every setting or every type of game, but for Call of Cthulhu, it's very fitting.
Well, it kind of can play into sort of the class-based notions of the period that it's depicting, right? Where you may be high intelligence but low education, and that could be something that could limit your character because you just didn't have paths to higher education in your background. And that can be an important distinction between characters in that world and setting, because they're not different based on how hard they swing a sword or what spells they know.
Yeah, being more of an investigative game, your actual pool of knowledge is specifically useful for figuring things out. One thing that I would say that's really handy about having education is its associated knowledge roll, which is basically, I don't know enough about 5th edition D&D to know how they handle this, but in 3rd edition, one of the qualities of being a bard was having what was called bardic knowledge. That might actually come from 2.5 as well, but it was sort of like the catch-all, like, have I heard it skill? And it was basically something that you either never used or you abused beyond all measure. Like if someone couldn't get a knowledge check on something, the bard would be like, oh, have I heard anything about this? Effectively, what education does is it gives everybody that quality to a greater or lesser extent. And it actually adds a numerical value to it. So that, like, yeah, I'm just a hobo that, has no particular education. I might be really intelligent. I might be able to figure things out, but my basis of knowledge about what the world is not as founded as like a professor who spent their life in education.
Yeah, exactly.
Another interesting, and this is a skill in Call of Cthulhu, is credit rating. We've talked about this one before, and I think that 7th edition does a better job of describing what this is and how you can use it than previous editions. But it essentially, the short version is it's basically how rich you are.
Yeah.
But it also could represent the influence of that money and capital. In some ways, it's so I don't have to count every coin. And it also kind of takes bargaining into effect a little bit.
It does.
So I think that might actually be a separate skill as well.
It's interesting in that it reflects not only what money can buy, but what additional social doors it can open.
Yeah. No, that's a big one. So like, can you get your way into the party? The first role to convince people that you belong there might be a credit rating check.
100%. And I've seen that used, by my GM, as well as it's been modified by our appearance. So my character had a high credit rating because of his background, but because I've been fighting monsters and running around in sewers, I had to take a huge penalty to it because I didn't match it. I didn't look right. So it has an interesting role play element, and it really ties into your characters and into the world in a pretty meaningful way. And credit rating was something that at first I didn't see any value and I didn't understand what it meant. But as we played more in urban settings in Call of Cthulhu, it really has an impact.
Yeah, and I think at some point we'll probably want to do an episode probably titled something like Wealth and Resources, where we talk about that aspect more specifically and how it scales and what effect it can have. Because there's a lot of games that actually have really clever ways of handling that.
Yeah, it's true.
So another game, when we're getting down to core stats that came to mind, and this is maybe a bit obscure, I'm sure some people still play it, but the Tristat system. And you probably, that name you might not recognize, but Tristat was the catch-all system for every anime game from the 90s. I've read some of these. I think Macross Gundam might have one. I know there's a Sailor Moon game that I thought was very entertaining to read. Yeah, just a whole bunch of those games where it seemed more for the sake of expediency, but a lot of those books, when I looked at them, pretty well researched, at least as far as they definitely watched the show.
I find the thing about Tristat is, it's kind of in the name, how they handle attributes, right? There's 3 of them. Mm-hmm. But I think the distinctions between them are almost like they're as low as you can go in a certain way, right?
We have one example that might go lower than that, but yes.
That is true. But it would be mind, body, and spirit. And these 3 stats, there are other games that do this. Cubicle 7's Age of Sigmar is like basically the same 3. Mm-hmm. But this idea that Dex and Strength and Con are kind of blurred into body. And then you've got your intelligence and your wisdom sort of blurred into mind, and then a little bit more of your wisdom and charisma kind of blurred into spirit. And the way that it takes those attributes and cuts them down is quite elegant, I find.
Yeah, if you were going to get down to essentials that at least differentiate each character from another character, this is about as simple. I guess lasers and feelings would be the only one that I think that breaks it down into 2.
Yeah.
But the 3 is nice because it's kind of analogous to the White Wolf World of Darkness games, which categorize along the lines of mental, physical, and social. Those are then broken down again into 3 other attributes with a total of 9, which is maybe a lot, but it's still following that same mindset that you see in Tristat. Again, with the social being a bit more of an tangible aspect of, and I think that the physical, mental, and social, somebody told me that actually is a framework used in psychology. So that could very well be where that comes from.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, Tristat also has an interesting aspect. This is more of a detail of it because I don't know how much we'll actually talk about it. Maybe we will. We might talk about multiple of the games together, but it has dice scaling. Which is an interesting idea. It's not a dice chain in the sense of, say, Dungeon Crawl Classics or Space Weirdos kind of uses a similar mechanic. But it's more the idea that you're rolling 2 dice, and standard would be 6, but your campaign, when you make your campaign, you choose what size of die you use to determine the scale of the game. So if you're playing a 2d6 game, you're playing ordinary people. If you're playing a 2d12 game, you're playing superhuman, like Dragon Ball Z type characters. There's even principles for increasing or decreasing the dice in any particular situation.
Right.
Now, the absolute smallest value you can come up with an attribute that we have found anywhere aside from not having one at all is Advanced Fighting Fantasy, which just has skill.
Right.
And that is a number between 1 and 12 or 2 and 12. we've mentioned this before in the episode about advanced fighting fantasy and fighting fantasy in general, that this is more analogous to level.
Yeah, it is.
Especially if you consider like how original Dungeons and Dragons handles it, where it's literally just level being the modifier, and then that's applied to whatever you're trying to do. So we've talked plenty about that. Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. That's an interesting one. There's a quirk in that game that is a remnant of the fact that it's basically a role-playing game from a war game, which you think we'd already done with D&D, but here it is again.
Here it is again.
And this is partly how they calculate stats. I don't think you have to do this, but it's a percentile-based game where the attribute is the focal point and skills bump that up. In that case, there are two attributes that are strangely wargamey, which are weapon skill and ballistic skill.
And they're built right into the core stat line, too.
I always found that weird, but I just kind of accept it. And I just sort of I think that suggests that that setting is just a violent place where I like to think when you're talking about core attributes, that means that everyone has a say or an opinion on that thing. And so violence exists enough in that world that everybody has some level of hand-to-hand or range fighting that they are measured in. The other one that I thought was really interesting and always stuck with me was the fact that they split dexterity into dexterity and agility. That makes a lot of sense to me. I mean, Troy, I'm not really sure what you think about dividing those, but it made me realize that there's a difference between being mobile with your body and being mobile with your hands, and how those don't necessarily exist in the same person. They might, and some of it's mental, obviously, but then I would argue actually initiative, being the other stat, is kind of what like mental quickness is. I mean, what are your feelings on like splitting the dexterity in Dungeons and Dragons into dexterity and agility?
Well, it's like hand fastness and foot fastness in a way, right? And I think that makes a lot of sense. It helps because it makes sort of the movement and the combat aspects of those two abilities separate from each other, in that you could have someone who's very agile but poor dexterity, so they would be really good at perhaps escaping or keeping themselves from harm, but they wouldn't really be very dangerous at all.
Or, you know, like they might be good at lock picking, but then maybe they're just clumsy when it comes to getting around, or, you know, if there's a chase and they have to gotta climb over something, they don't quite get it.
Yeah, exactly. I could definitely see a way of interpreting like a halfling character in that sense.
Yeah, exactly. The sort of fleet of foot versus fleet of hand.
100%.
So another one, and this is certainly an influential game as to exactly how much it's actually played and not just used as a reference guide, is GURPS. GURPS has 4 stats. It has strength, dexterity, intelligence, and health. I find it interesting that most of those are physical, and then one of them is sort of a catch-all for mental stuff. And I think that comes from the idea that some of the mental figuring in that sort of like suggests or is emphasized in GURPS is more about you as the player figuring things out. And then intelligence is just sort of like a broad area that encompasses that. And of course, it's a skill-based game, so it's going to have a lot of knowledges and other abilities. There's also all kinds of traits that can affect your character. Jokingly, it's the game where you can figure out a ruling in book by combining other rulings for getting how well do I fight while on fire and in water? I've heard that as a way of referencing how detailed it actually is. It also has some interesting derivatives. So it has fatigue is a better way. I think it's fatigue and hit points, which sound similar. So fatigue is essentially exhaustion. And usually if there's any kind of exertive activity or skill usage, that begins to burn down, and then it affects sort of like a timer on your character when they need to rest or recover. It could also somewhat affect, if you don't want to include sanity mechanics or fear mechanics, it can kind of work as a substitute.
Right.
And then hit points is hit points. Works exactly the same way.
Now, this next game is a personal favorite, and it has a really interesting way to look at ability or attributes. The Legend of Five Rings uses an elemental-based system for the attributes. The 5 that you have are earth, air, water, fire, and void. And these both represent physical, emotional, and intellectual states.
Yeah. This, when I encountered it, was it definitely made me feel that this game was really different, because it doesn't, this is the perfect example. It made me realize that how you categorize something with words makes a big difference about how you think about the character operating. So every character has stats in these 5 elements, which are associated with the 5 rings of the setting. And like earth is kind of like constitution, but it's also your ability to focus. A lot of them have more like mental examples than physical ones.
Mm-hmm.
Air is like stealth, but it's also your ability to be kind of, to use implicit language or innuendo, which is really useful in a game that's basically about a samurai court. Water is more of your sort of traditional agility, but it also includes things like empathy. Fire is your passion and your focus. It's also your sort of quickness of mind, your wit. And then void is sort of the ineffable sort of spiritual nature. I'm going to try to describe how it works, but it's, in a lot of ways, it sort of comes down to spell casting, but that's not really fair because they all do that as well.
It's true.
But void has this kind of, it's a sort of ineffable quality about a character, their spirit in some sense, even though some of what void represents is the opposite of that.
I love the way that by picking 2 of these elemental attributes, you can tell so much about a character.
But in a totally different way. That's the thing I thought was really cool about it. I have some issues with the game, but it's not about how it was built. It's actually, I would argue, the short answer to that is it's built too well.
Right.
And so it makes it difficult to invest in. But the way that they handle their core attributes is really cool.
And now for something completely different, a war game that uses different characteristics would be Necromunda. We're referencing E23 here because it's the one I'm most familiar with, but it has a lot of your classic Warhammer 40k statistics, right? That you're used to with those, again, weapon skill and ballistic skill making appearance. But it also has more psychological skills like cool, willpower, and intelligence joining the leadership that you're familiar with from 40k. And it tells you more about the game you're going to be playing when you have these psychological attributes that you're going to be triggering and using as stats. If, for example, in a lot of games, leadership would just be used for all of the above. But it's so cool that you'll have these distinctions, like cool is your ability to be cool under fire. If someone goes down next to you, it's not necessarily a leadership question, it's your cool. Do you hold? The same way that willpower is a question of, can you psychically resist someone trying to control your mind? And that's not really leadership. And another game, this is more of an indie title by Nordic Weasel Games. It's called 5 Core Skirmish. It's a modern warfare tabletop game for a squad to a platoon of modern troopers. This game has no statistics for troopers, as they are all part of the base rules. So the idea is that a soldier is a soldier is a soldier. So that's not what separates them. It's more how they react in the moment and statistical exceptions to the baseline based on context. So some troops may be able to change a base reaction based on who they are or their training or background, but all troops are roughly the same shots, roughly the same toughness. It's more about how they navigate the contexts. And it's a really fun, really satisfying game. And I find it really easy to pick up because you don't really need to know a bunch of different stats for all these different troops. Everyone sort of has a baseline of behavior and you go from there.
Now, another extremely notable example, and now we're kind of like running in and out of order here, but Numenera and any of the Cypher games have a really fascinating way they handle, especially attributes, which they call stat pools. So there's 3 of them, so you get that core 3. But the thing that makes them unique is that they are also a depletable or spendable resource, and they operate in a hierarchy related to damage. So I believe they are power, speed, and intelligence. And the idea is that when you take damage, you actually lose from your first pool, which is your physical pool. And then when that's depleted, you get a penalty, and then it starts dipping out on your speed until that's depleted, and then you basically lose consciousness. And then if you keep getting kicked while you're down, you lose all your intellect. I think that's what it was. And then you're dead. And that's a cool way of unifying it, because also abilities burn skills. And so there's this nice ecosystem. I don't know that it works in every situation, even though it's touted as, Cypher system. It's like, oh, you can start it in like only a few hours and it works for everything. I think that's technically true. I think it works better for some things than others.
Right.
But that feature about it having spendable pools really changes how you think about your character. Another sort of quick example about using a breakdown of different skills and somehow how abilities tie into the world more directly is Cyberpunk 2020. This is the older Cyberpunk game. I'm less familiar with Cyberpunk Red, but I think it might do something similar.
Mm-hmm.
Along with having your basic statistics for like intelligence, they have a reflex, cool, which is similar to Necromunda. But they also have technical ability. And because technology is so integrated into that world, it actually deserves its own sort of core ability stat. And then from there, it's basically a skill-based game. The physical stat is essentially reduced down to one that's called body type. And it's actually quite intricate, but that determines more or less how tough you are. We got Coriolis, so that's Free League Publishing. That one's neat because I think I already sort of described this briefly, but you have 4 core attributes. So they are strength, agility, wits, and empathy. And then those have extended skills. I think for Coriolis, it's 2 each. For games like Alien, it's 3, generally between those numbers. And they're sort of like subsets of that skill. And what you do is you take your core value and your skill associated with the task, and that's the number of dice that you roll. So it's a dice pool system. Over the Edge, we briefly talked about this.
Oh, yeah.
Jokingly, you can play anything in that game, including stuff that makes no sense. And it basically, you're just attaching traits. It doesn't even have core attributes. It's more just skills. And the division is between how specific the skill and how good you are at it.
Right.
And that's the extent of the balance of the game. And finally, and this game deserves its own, like, we're definitely going to have to review this game because it's so different from everything else, is Amber, or sometimes called Amber Diceless.
Yes.
And this is a game that has just core attributes for the most part. It does have special abilities that tie into it, but it's a game that it's a role-playing game that uses no dice at all. And character creation is based on an auction bidding system. And the basic way to describe the uniqueness of this is if you are the one with that ability, you are the best at it. That's the sort of short answer. There's a bit more nuance to that, but it's more like a ranking system where I outrank you, therefore I am the best at this.
Right.
And it just sort of breaks down from there. So that is the basically extent of, I mean, there are so many different ways I'm probably missing out. And Troy, we looked around and went through every major game we could think of. A lot of them were pretty well the same with just a different name.
Yeah.
But you out there, please, like if you're on YouTube, let us know if there's a game that you think has a really unique system that we didn't mention.
Yeah. Throw it in the comments. That would be awesome.
Yeah. And if you think that if you think there's something that we might want to touch on later, please let us know.
Yeah, exactly. We're really open to hearing from the community. And if people have thoughts or suggestions, just shoot them at us.
Yeah, this was a huge topic, and there's no way we covered everything.
Exactly. And our next week's topic will be an interesting one as we get into the spooky month. We're going to be talking about Chill 2nd edition.
Yeah. So, get your Halloween spirit on and get ready for that one, as it is a horror game that is like Call of Cthulhu, but not at all like Call of Cthulhu. Until then, happy gaming and have a good one.
Have a good one.
We hope you enjoyed delving in today's episode. A big thanks to all of you out there for joining us. If you want to continue the conversation, you can find us on Instagram and YouTube at Tales and Tactics Podcast, or on our website, neonlithicinteractive.com. Join us again on the next episode of Tales and Tactics.